interesting program. The supply chain professors have worked with companies in the supply chain field, and one of the big pieces of feedback they got was that supply chain individuals need to know Tableau. So kind of interesting to where I am today, supply chain, but now I'm a business intelligence developer. So not really using what I was trained on in school, but I also did get a business data analytics certificate from ASU. So I kind of felt like this guy down here at the bottom at the beginning, just like, look at all this data, what am I gonna do with it? Scratching my head, very confused. But I found myself gravitating towards Tableau, just the simplicity of the environment, and just the drag and drop. There was a ton of information online, the user community was great, and so I just kind of found myself gravitating towards Tableau. I did have experience in a couple other softwares, but still, at the end of the day, Tableau was the one that I found myself moving towards. Around the time that I graduated in May of 2015, I started working at this company called TRAX Technologies, which for me was a really exciting opportunity. It's a supply chain freight bill and audit payment company. So essentially they get all these invoices from companies shipping goods using FedEx, using DHL, and we have a system that automates it, basically finding the charges that you should be paying for so that way you don't spend more money than you need to. So if a freight bill was shipped, or a package was shipped on Monday, and FedEx delivers it on Thursday, but FedEx charged for a weekend delivery, you shouldn't have to pay that. So our system automatically declines that charge. So you're only paying what you really need to. I was also fortunate enough to go to the Tableau Conference this past year in Austin. This was actually an incredible opportunity. One for the networking, met a bunch of incredible people. It was all Tableau all the time. Just getting your hands on seeing new features, providing feedback to the developers. You're able to take part in some experiments to see how your eye navigated across dashboards and to really understand the flow of the human brain when you see a Tableau dashboard for the first time. So I highly recommend it. It's an incredible opportunity. You will learn a lot from this conference. On top of that, there's also a ton of entertainment. They had Bill Nye the Science Guy, Sean Kirvin Dansom was there, Mr. Wise Walk the Moon, just a lot on top of data just to make sure that you really have a good time, you get to connect with people. So again, highly suggest going. So, jumping into things. Data governance. Who was here at last month's meeting? Raise your hand. All right, so a few of you. So you got an early preview into data governance. Michael talked about it a little bit. And so I kind of wanted to build on top of that and to show a use case into what we're using, but also kind of help clarify data governance at its basic level. So, what is data governance? In its essence, it's the management of the availability, usability, integrity, and security of the data. So, availability, making sure that everybody has access to data anytime, anywhere, and using whatever device they want. So being able to publish data up to Tableau server and making sure that everybody can access the same piece of information. So usability. This is what Michael talked about last month. Renaming fields in Tableau can have a huge impact on the end users. If you create a self-serve environment, which is one of the benefits of data governance, renaming a field to a friendly name as opposed to a bunch of different characters jumbled up or a shortened version of the word country into 3 letters, just creating a simple version of the name in your data source can have a huge impact on your end users, both the developers but consumers of self-serve analytics. The integrity. This is a huge part of data governance, and I'm going to talk about it again in the future, but having a single source of truth. If you have multiple people that are creating a query in SQL Server to generate the data, there could be disparate filters, somebody could have an additional item in their where clause, and so you might not all be pulling the same data set, so your result set is going to be inherently different. By taking advantage of a data governance model and creating one data source that everybody can then use, you know that everybody's going to be getting that same data set, and the results that they pull back are going to be the same no matter what they are using. So it's really nice to make sure that everybody's on that same page. All the logic and calculations are the same. And then you get a bunch of reusability benefits as well. So the security side, data governance is great because you can involve a governing body with your IT organization to help lock down permissions of the data, just to make sure that company A cannot see company B's data. Also, depending on the level of the individual within the organization, an associate might not be able to see certain financial classification data or certain payment transactions. And so data governance allows you to get into some row-level security just to prevent certain users from seeing data that they're really not authorized to see. And also, you don't want company A to see company B's data. So in a nutshell, that's data governance. So jumping into the use case. So as I said before, TRAX Technologies is a freight bill and audit payment company, but on top of that, we provide a pretty significant business intelligence layer. So we utilize Tableau Server, and we have about 40 customers. Of these 40 customers, we have a set of 12 standard reports that we give out to all of our customers. Now, when I first started at TRAX, these were deployed as Tableau packaged workbooks, meaning each workbook had its own data source. So that could be a huge nightmare. So again, everything was published up to Tableau Server, and so we were packaging up the data sources in the workbooks, which was a lot of work. Easy math, well actually, sorry, jumping back. Of the 12 standard reports, we identified that 10 of those reports had a significant overlap of data and context. And so for our example today, we're going to focus on those 10. So here's the easy math. That's 400 data sources. Now, when I started, there were a couple other people on the team. Currently, I'm the only business intelligence developer. I don't want to maintain 400 data sources. If I want to change the calculation once, I have to change it 400 times. I have to also publish the data source back up to the server 400 times. Do you know how long that would take? Way too long. Not a good use of the time. Deployments were nuts. And you had to, as I said, manipulate calculations multiple times. So we went through an exercise of how can we improve our environment. So we started to look at the workbooks. And what we found was that our data was pretty much 3 levels of data. We had a high-level data set. So essentially, if you get a receipt from a grocery store, what was the total of that receipt? Another level got into the actual charges. So when I went to the grocery store, I bought bananas, water, and cereal. The other layer was then getting into the financial classification part of it. So when I went to the grocery store, I paid 1/3 of that transaction with a gift card I had, and then 2/3 of that with my credit card. So we identified that of those 10, we could really segment it down 3 ways, and there was a ton of overlap in that data. Although they were all using those workbooks up here were using very similar levels of data, obviously the workbooks itself had a different scope. So what I mean by that is we had some self-serve analytics that had like 3 years of data. Some of our standard reports had 4 months, some had 6 quarters. So although the basic level of the data was the same, the time period was different. We also filtered for different things, such as whether it had been paid or whether the receipt was still pending and it was still open. And so there were ways that we could go about that. When we were also getting into this, we noticed that there were disparities between the logic. Not all calculations were the same across the same data sources, even though the application was supposed to be reporting the same information across customers. Some values were not being categorized the same in case statements. We were also using various calculations to calculate the change in time, or the length of time. What we found is that they were not all using the same dates, and so they were providing very different values. So I would have to make those changes 400 times. So we started to get into a period where, how can we improve this? We had identified that we could segment them up into 3 groups, but where do we go from there? So one of the big benefits of Tableau Server is the ability to publish information up to the server and have your consumer or your end user hit the server, access the workbook, access the data source, but you have the ability to leverage a published data source and then connect the workbooks to that data source. So that's where we went. So those 3 levels, we made a single data source for those 3 levels of data. In those 3 data sources, we had all 40 customers, and then all 10 reports were able to connect to that data source. So we went from 400 data sources down to 3, which was about a 99% reduction, which was incredible. So this was a lot easier to maintain, obviously. I only had to make the change 3 times, and then only do 3 publishing exercises. So there was a ton of benefit from doing this, being the only developer on the team. When time is a critical asset and it's not infinite, I couldn't spend weeks or pretty much an entire sprint making changes to a data source and publishing it up to the server. So we went this method. We published the data sources with that full 3-year scope for our self-serve analytics. And then when you connect your workbook to the data source, there's a data source filter, which if you're familiar with the order of operations for Tableau and the way that filters are executed, when you generate an extract filters are the highest level when it comes to evaluating filters. Second to that are data source filters. So we created the extract with a 3-year window as the extract filter and pretty much brought in whatever data we could. Then we got into Tableau Desktop, took the workbook, and connected it to the data source that was published up to Tableau Server. From there, we had the ability to create our data source filters and really focus in on the data that the workbook was actually needing to focus on. So we had the ability to trim back the date range. So now we were only looking at 4 months in some of the workbooks. We were only looking at paid receipts in some of the workbooks. So although our data source had all this data in it, the workbook itself was actually a much smaller scope of that full data set. So this also allowed for a couple other benefits. So on top of very few data sources, the deployments were much easier, maintenance was much easier, but we were able to reuse calculations. So we did identify that there were certain calculations that were actually used in like 5 or 6 workbooks. So the same calculation would have to be maintained in those 5 or 6 data sources times 40. It's a headache. So we were able to make the calculation once and reuse it in those 5 workbooks. We were also able to create a template workbook. So if we were trying to roll out an enhancement to one of the applications in the past, we would have to open up each workbook for each customer and add a filter or change what we were wanting to do in a visualization or add a % of total to a visualization. Then we had to do that for every other customer. So the benefit of the published data sources and allowed us to create a template workbook. So what we did was, yes, all customers were in one data source. So how did we limit that? We created a parameter called pClient, which was essentially a client filter. We threw that up on the data source filter as well. So that way, yes, we're only looking at 4 months of paid receipts, but now we're only looking at data for company A. So this allowed us to then change the parameter value to company B, go through the publishing exercise, publish up that same workbook. Change it to company C, publish it up, utilize the same workbook, and repeat that process 40 times. Now, that was still an exhaustive exercise, but it was much easier to maintain than making the changes 40 times and publishing the workbooks up 40 times. Being able to make the change once, but then going through a publishing process 40 times, we saved countless hours just by doing so. It also allowed us to create a self-serve analytics environment. So this kind of built on top of the previous analytics that we had, allowing users to do some basic ad hoc queries. We provided the web edit environment on Tableau Server to users, so that way they could create their own visualizations, but that was pretty much it. So on top of that, we then rolled out this Analytics Center capability, leveraging the published data sources, so that way a user could go through the same motions of connecting to that data source on Tableau Server, opening up the applications, creating your little visualizations as you see fit, dragging in whatever dimensions and measures we provided to you. But then we rolled out the feature for Save As. So we created this analytics center where users had the ability to save into a custom folder and reuse workbooks over and over. So you could save into a My Views project and create your own repository on Tableau server of workbooks that you thought were meaningful. As an organization, we have a very significant number of people that are customer facing in a customer relationships manager role, who on a monthly basis would have to sit down with the customer and kind of go over their monthly finances, how are the carriers doing, yada yada. The benefit of this was they were able to then create that workbook once and then refresh it every month, get the data that they needed for their MBR, and then provide it to the customer very easily. Before going down the published data source route, they would have to recreate that report every month. So there was the chance that they would forget that they put a filter on to exclude these values, or we were only trying to look at an amount greater than X. Now they had the ability to create that report once and reuse it monthly. We also rolled it out to external users, so that way they had the ability to, yes, save into My Views, but we also rolled out the feature that they can save within the organization. So now we had this collaborative environment that as a user in company A, I could create a report and save it to my project, but I could also save it to anybody else in company A. So this was a really big learning point. The users started to become more empowered. We started to see we've definitely seen a big adoption, especially internally. The use of this tool has been tremendous. We're also seeing that there's less custom work coming our way. Prior to rolling this out, a CRM would ask us, hey, can you pull the data for this customer for this reason? Now we provided them the tooling that they can do so themselves. So we really went through the exercise to empower the users and make data available to anybody in the organization when we really are a data company and we have a very large volume of data. When you have 40 customers and millions of invoices coming in, there's a lot of information that can be extracted from that. So the published data sources really allowed us to take full advantage of that. Now, looking at this model, there is no perfect model, so there are obviously weaknesses to this. Depending on your security structure and what your organization allows, there could be a huge risk or a big red flag with the fact that we have 40 customers in one data source. If that client, the P client value, is not implemented correctly on the data source, or the permissions are not locked down on the workbook when you publish it up to the server, there is obviously the risk of a customer being able to access customer B's data. So the permissions for this were huge. This is why we implemented a move to production process involving a team of people to go through a peer review. I was a developer, I passed it along to Anne validated my work, she gave me the golden ticket, and then we published it out to the customer. So we needed to get a couple people's hands on it so that way we knew that the workbook was safe, that client parameter was hidden in the workbook, so that way it wasn't accessible anywhere. It was also taking a long time to refresh these extracts, as you can imagine. If you have 40 customers and some of these customers receive millions of invoices every year, well, now we have 3 years of receipts for each customer. It's a lot of data. So our extracts process was taking hours. We were actually getting into about 12, 16 hours throughout the day where extracts were being refreshed, which unfortunately we saw took a pretty significant beating on the end user performance. Unfortunately, I have to say that our dev server was faster than our prod server, which is the complete opposite way of how it should be. And these large data sets obviously have a little bit to do with that. So which is why Model B we're migrating towards should be more conducive to your environment, as well as the volume of data that you have. So, Model B. Very similar, leveraging the published data sources, but in this model, each customer has their own data source. Much more secure, much smaller extracts, but still getting those benefits of leveraging Tableau Server, leveraging the published data sources so that way it's easier for the developer to maintain, as I said previously, strengths and weaknesses to each model. So we went from 400 data sources now down to 120, which is still about a 70% reduction, so it's still a significant savings. It was a lot less to maintain, a lot less to refresh, but obviously if you have to make a change, now you have to make those changes possibly 120 times. So yes, more secure, faster refresh time, still allows you to reuse those calculations. So I can make the calculation once and reuse it in those 5 workbooks. You could still have the template workbook, so we still have the ability to create one workbook, and then you can go into Tableau Desktop, connect to a new published data source, swap the connections around. You still get some of the benefits of a template workbook, but from my experience, there are quirks that can come about when swapping a published data source or swapping a data source in general. Some of the filters can lose their formatting, which then is a nightmare to reformat. Maybe it's just the version that we are on. We're pretty far behind. So hopefully they fix that in newer versions. But it also it would take for longer deployments if you don't have the appropriate tooling. So what I mean by that is we've leveraged the enterprise deployment tool from Interworks, which is a part of this Power Tools package, which allows you to create these deployment plans that are essentially reusable. It allows you to get into a lot of really cool things that Tableau Desktop allows you to do as well. Replacing images, changing parameter values, changing data sources. But Interworks gives you this nice UI on top of that where you can make all those changes once, get into the workbook from their Interworks window, and outline what you want to change. So for our organization, this model is a little bit more conducive because we have that enterprise deployment tool. So what it does is you essentially have one workbook, make the change one time, set up all your enterprise deployment plans for the 40 customers of swapping the data source, swapping the customer logo, doing whatever manipulations you need to, but they have this really nice PowerShell window on top of that, which allows you to then execute all 40 plans with a click of a button. So now our deployments are taking sheer minutes. So I can literally click our deployment plan and walk away from my computer, and their tool is going to publish up the data source to the server without me even being there. What's also great about that is if you create it once and develop your environment so that way the plans are reusable, meaning that the names of the data sources never change, names of the workbooks never change, or the project names align. You can create those plans today, and in 3 years from now, you would be able to use those same plans over and over again. So there's a significant reusability from it, significant time savings, but also one of the benefits of this tool was getting the human hands off of the deployments and pushing them out to the customer after knowing that the plan was created correctly. So when you're deploying a report, publishing something up to Tableau Server, everybody has the possibility of making a mistake. And we did have a couple instances where customer A's report was published to customer B. The enterprise deployment tool helped alleviate that because we were able to craft the plans once, go through a validation period to know that, okay, customer A is going to be customer A, customer B will be customer B. And once it was crafted, then the risk is gone. Now the human interaction is completely removed, and the chance of customer A getting customer B's data is pretty much non-existent anymore. So tons of benefits from that. But obviously without that tooling, it would be more difficult to swap the data sources around. There are the chance that the formatting could be lost on some of the filters, and the deployments are going to take much longer. But from what we saw, segmenting the extracts up into individual customers, for one example, we would go down, the data source would take about 4 or 5 hours to refresh as a whole. Going into individual customers, those 40 customers collectively could run in about 40 minutes. So it allows you to take advantage of the parallelism on Tableau server. Instead of one data source refreshing, now you can have 4 data sources refreshing simultaneously. So just another benefit of going more towards this route over Model A. So that's pretty much the 2 models that we have tested out. They're pretty much meant to help your brain start churning, to help think about ways that you could implement a data governance model into your organization. There are a ton of resources online. So this was a pretty good white paper that Tableau provides. They have this entire Learn section on their website with white papers out the wazoo. But there's also just a ton of other resources that I found as well. So definitely suggest looking on their Learn section of the website, finding the white paper. So summarizing it up, obviously implement data governance. The benefits that we saw from implementing a system like this were tremendous. The amount of time that it took to to deploy a report or an enhancement was cut down drastically. Then by leveraging the Tableau Enterprise or the InterWorks Enterprise deployment tool on top of that, the deployments were even faster. The human risk for error was completely mitigated. The deployments were much easier to maintain. Obviously, jumping back to the definition of data governance, the integrity was much better. Now we know that all customers are using the same calculation when we're trying to determine how long it took to process an invoice. We're also able to reuse those calculations so that way you can have that same calculation once and leverage it in multiple workbooks without having to recraft it or make the change in multiple places. So it's a little intro to data governance, not really an intro, but more of a use case, I should say. So yeah, I'll open it up to any questions if you want to know some of the pain points or just questions on data governance in general.
What's exactly the name of the InterWorks product?
So it's packaged up as Power Tools. It's InterWorks Power Tools.
So Power Tools comes in 3 to 4 products. So they've got the one you're talking about is the enterprise deployment tool, right? Where
Yes.
you're actually packaging up. So this is going to be for your administrators that either have large deployments or they want to streamline a lot of their processes. And this helps you architect those solutions and really just automate it versus like he was talking about spending hours on doing the same monotonous task over and over and over again.
You hired interns for.
That's how I started out, and that's what I was doing. Yeah, so on their website, they have a lot of other cool tools besides the deployment tool. You can get into, let's see if I can expand this up. You can get into some like auditing of the workbooks to see like what your workbooks are connected to, the data sources as well. They allow you to audit your workbooks for performance. So it will kind of give you some suggestions, which is kind of going off what I know because we don't have these tools. You can merge workbooks, so if you have a bunch of individual workbooks with some various views, you have the ability to then open up their window, take the views that you want, and merge them into a single workbook. They have a nice like color tool where you can kind of create some like funky little palettes. But it's actually a pretty cool company. There's a lot that they offer. We've seen a ton of benefit from just the deployment tools in general. So I'm not trying to give them a plug, but it's a great tool.
So the 2 are for if you have server, if you're using desktop in your environment, the top one, Power Tools for maybe down, desktop. And that's like the one he said, if you want to look at performance on your workbook, make sure it's not going to kill the system, or you're actually doing the best practices. That's got all those other things built into it, which is actually pretty cool.
Okay, I have a question.
All right.
The document API, did you get into that at all? It's kind of a newer thing.
We explored it a little bit. When we looked at the document API, there wasn't much functionality. We couldn't really get that far into the workbooks to satisfy what we were trying to do.
Gotcha.
With all the manipulations that we were wanting for like the parameters, images, at first we found that it couldn't satisfy our need. That was several months ago that we looked into it, so they might have expanded out the capabilities now. But at first we found that it wasn't conducive to what we were trying to do.
That's good to know. So for those of you guys that aren't aware, Tableau is kind of expanding what they call their document API to do some of this stuff. I think they recommend. It's in Python, most of it, I think, but it automates a lot of this stuff as well. The Interworks model, they do XML like ripping and hacking, so this is a more, what I guess Tableau would say, legitimate way to do it and a free way to do it. But just know they're both out there, and here's the details on it. There you go.
They're both hacking XML.
True, you're right. One's, I guess, just Tableau telling you how to hack it, yeah. No, believe me, I support both methodologies. I would take a GUI all day, be on the console.
Yeah, so the environment that Interworks puts on it is much easier to maintain. It's easier to use. One of the other benefits of the tool is that you can cross servers and cross sites, which we've seen significant benefits of. If you were trying to publish a workbook from dev into prod and you were leveraging published data sources, you would need to download the data source, create a local copy, sign out of the server on dev, sign into the prod server. Just a nightmare. So the tool allows you to programmatically go across servers, across sites. So the Model B that I had shown, go back. This model would allow you to have individual customer sites on Tableau server. Depending on your data governance model and what IT allows, you might need to have customer A on their own site and customer B on their own site. So this model would allow that. The enterprise deployment tool on top of that would make it much easier to publish a report from one site to the other site without having to create a local copy of the data source. Just really streamlines the process. Any other questions?
So most of this was geared towards kind of the server.
Yes.
So can you talk to a little bit about how one would do this if they don't have a server? Maybe some of the better practices.
Yeah, so good question.
Shared folder. Shared folder.
Yeah, okay. So if you didn't have Tableau server, ways that you could still go about a data governance model, making me think on this one.
That's why you're up there.
Yeah. To be honest, it would definitely, I would have to think about it.
So I would
Still, go ahead.
tell you what I want to hear what you would do, Michael, but I'll tell you kind of what I've seen is publish almost like an extract to a shared folder and give people permissions to just read only from it, and that's kind of how you would make. Yeah, I think in this day and age, servers totally the way to go. But if you're standing up something or you're a very small company, I think that's probably what you kind of see, Michael, or.
Yeah, it'd be baby steps. So everything that you talked about, I think, is that end stage where you want to be. But if you're new to Tableau and you're trying to prove this concept out, how do I get to that point? Well, I'm going to create my data sources in Tableau. I'm not going to create the visualizations on top of that. And I'm going to put that TDS file, Tableau extract, whatever it might be, onto a shared drive.
Right.
Looking at then the permissions, all right, it was locked down at the Windows level through access. And then mature it from that point. The more you're going to grow and you got larger customers, the demand's going to grow. So you go to a tool like this, you script it out in one of the APIs, or that's kind of where I'm at. And so start there.
Is that the answer you were looking for? You get it right?
It all depends. I mean, how big you are. If you're just a one guy shop, still you practice those methodologies just on your local computer. You know, put in your my Tableau repository and your data sources. That's why the folder's there. But it all depends on what the use case is. I try to stay away from building everything all in one workbook, especially if I'm going to repeat the process. Practice that data governance right from the start.
Anything else?
I have another question for you.
What's up, Ann?
Yeah, so you talk about going to like an extract model and cutting down your data sources. Were you able to leverage any of the aggregation capabilities, or did you notice any of that where the granularity of your data was, too specific, like to the day, and you really only had visualizations that were at the month, and you could cut that down at all?
So unfortunately, where we are at as an organization, and where I don't fully agree, is the organization wants to see the data as granular as possible and showing the individual records, which is Yes, killing performance. So another way that we're going now and testing things is pre-aggregating views, aggregating the data source to the level of granularity in the workbook. If we're only showing a monthly trend, rolling up all the dates to the month level. So kind of going about it that way. But unfortunately with our system, we like those individual records.
Well, yeah, when it's like whatever 10 million, you know, cut down a month, guys. Like, you have 5 a minute.
Don't have to lecture me about that one. Yeah, so I mean there are other options when you're going this method. You also don't necessarily need to use an extract. You could still go about a live connection and publish that live connection up to Tableau server. You would still get the full benefits of the data governance model. Depending on the volume of data, the performance might not be ideal, and that was one thing that we did notice, was that a live connection would take a little while. Our database wasn't also tuned to support a live connection or a star schema really, so that was kind of where we were also shooting ourselves in the foot. So depending on your environment, you might not have the capability to refresh extracts that long all day. So if the volume of data is much smaller, if you're using pre-aggregated views, a live query connection published up to Tableau server could also be a really good option.
How was this? Was it any of it live?
No, it was all extracts.
From what?
SQL Server.
Were you using any stored procedures or views?
We were using views. We had created a couple views that were specific to certain workbooks and to different applications. So yeah, all the views we had in our more recent deployments, the views were focused on just the basic minimum columns versus some data sources had every column in their mother, so that way you could figure out what type of paperclip was used on the freight bill. So yeah, we have started to collapse down the data sources, which is allowing the refreshes to go much faster. The workbooks are more performant. Really, you don't need all the information in your applications.
So when you're mentioning about like that parameterization to pick the customer, how did you do that? Did you call it via stored procedure or?
So the parameter was basic because we had a column of clients, so it would show all clients. So we did a condition filter, so client equals p client. So then it would really only turn the exact value. So if you typed in company A, it would only pull back company A. So we threw that as a data source filter, very high level. And then we obviously hid that in the workbook, pretty much hid the parameter wherever possible. None of our users have access to Tableau server, or Tableau desktop, excuse me. If they did, they also didn't know the credentials to get into the server, so they wouldn't have been able to get up to our data sources either. So model A, with all customers in one extract, the permissions were key. And that's why the move to production process was so important, to make sure that that parameter wasn't hiding out somewhere at the bottom corner of a visualization. So that was one of the biggest things that we had to go through. And the move to production process was actually pretty worthwhile, because we also kind of added on a group workshop, which allowed anybody in the team to see the workbook before we rolled it out. It was nice because it was very collaborative, so everybody had the opportunity to provide some feedback. We would incorporate some things in future iterations, but it allowed everybody on the team to realize that their voice was important. All right, any last questions? Awesome. Well, thank you guys.